In today's video, we will be looking at the coronation of Richard II. Coronations in England are rather different to their continental counterparts. They've roughly been the same for over 1,000 years, and they serve a number of different valuable purposes, but mainly three. The first purpose is to create a moment or an event marking the beginning of a new chapter in the country's history. It's strange to think that royal events or events of just two seemingly normal people will have such a big impact on a country. But cast your mind back to, well, just a few years ago, and something that you'll probably remember, which is the marriage of Kate Middleton and Prince William. This wasn't a coronation, but the event itself and the process by which they got married did actually increase the economy in London. It provided a boom for British tourism, and it was something that people across the country celebrated. And a coronation really has to be seen in a very, very similar vein to this. If we go back 60 years, we have our last coronation, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Now, the coronation at that time can only really be described by thinking about the marriage of William and Kate, but just on overdrive. This was an unbelievable occasion for the people of the day. It was actually the first British live televised moment, and that really just shows you how important this event was to the people of Britain. And really a coronation has that exact purpose. It has the purpose of trying to get people in the country invested back into the monarchy and really seeing that this is something that they should invest time in, they should invest their faith in. And this has been the case for over 1,000 years, and it certainly was the case over 700 years ago with Richard II. So how can a coronation have a purpose of marking in a new chapter or a new era in a country's history? Well, it's more about the formal procession of it all. The picture that you'll see here was the official route of Elizabeth II's coronation over 60 years ago. Coronations aren't just a solemn affair where a king or a queen goes to a church and they are suddenly become king. This is a procession, this is a day, this is an event which everyone wants to be a part of. And this map that you'll see here is something that actually is very common for about 1,000 years. When a king or a queen wishes to be coronated, they go through a procession. And that procession is an excuse to show to the ordinary people, the layman people, that they are the new ruler of this country. And it is a very, very formal process. The second main purpose of a coronation seems fairly obvious. It's a legal process. This is something that a country has to do if it was to usher in a new king or queen. Possibly the most famous example of where this legality was so important was in the coronation of William the Conqueror in 1066. This was a ruler who'd come from a foreign land, come from Normandy, had defeated the English king, Harold, and needed to make sure that the people of England understood that he was now ruler. Now, without that process of coronation, there's no formality to it. So William really understood the importance of this, and he made sure that on Christmas Day in 1066 that he rushed to Westminster Abbey and that he had himself crowned as king, so that the people understood very, very clearly that he was their ruler. And finally, the third and perhaps, well, not really even perhaps, definitely the most important purpose behind the coronation was to display to the people of the country about the concept of divine right of kingship. Now, this particular concept has changed in English history, but if we take it from a medieval perspective, there was only one true religion in the country, and it was Christianity, and it was Catholicism that dominated medieval religion. If you even dared to question religion, if you dared to question the Catholic faith, there would be severe, severe consequences. We'll look at that in future videos. We'll look at new groups that came across and tried to question Catholicism's role within society and within the monarchy. But for right now, it's worth just stating that this is incredibly crucial and incredibly important to not just the people, but to the clergy, to the lords, and to the king itself. But why then was religion so important for this coronation process? Well, this following model is something that a lot of you will be familiar with. It's the feudal system. The feudal system was a way of governing different people. It's something that really has been abolished across most societies in the world at the moment. But back in the medieval era, it was very, very commonplace. In actual fact, it was pretty much universal. Every single country used this system. But how was this system, I suppose, reintroduced? How was it reaffirmed to the people? Well, it was reaffirmed through the coronation process. If you have a look at the model that's in front of you, you can look at the bottom and you can see that there's far more people there. If we just say that these people are the peasantry, they're just the normal people within the country. If you go a bit higher, there's less people. We could say that they are more knights, they're local landlords. If you go a bit further up, you'll have the bigger lords, the lords who control larger regions of the country. If you go a bit further up, you'll find the most important lords in the country. You'll find the clergy as well. And at the very top, you find a singular figure. That singular figure is the monarch. And in this case, if we're particularly talking about the medieval era, we're talking about a king rather than a queen. So how do they get to the top? How are they judged to be better than, well, I suppose better and also more important than the people right at the bottom of this pile? Well, it's through the coronation process. Religion holds the answer. God has decided that that particular person should be the anointed ruler of that country. This process, or this whole concept, is called the divine right of kingship. Now, in today's day and age, this has been questioned. It was questioned back in the 17th century when Charles I lost his head after, well, I suppose, getting into some tricky situations with Parliament. But back in the medieval era, it was very, very important to state to the people that your king was put there by God. So let's now look at the coronation of Richard II. Richard II's coronation is in a lot of ways very, very similar to other coronations of medieval kings, but also very different as well. And we'll look at some of the reasons why it was different and why it was special within the lesson itself. But the purpose behind this video is to really go through the course of the coronation of Richard II and how it came to be. The first thing to really state is that Richard shouldn't have been king at all in 1377. If you look to your left here, you'll find Edward III. Edward III, King of England for over 40 years, is renowned as being one of England's most effective rulers. He was effective abroad as well in domestic issues. His son, Edward the Black Prince, or Edward of Woodstock, was everyone's expected new king, and everyone would have been particularly happy with him becoming ruler. He was a celebrated general in war. He had helped defeat the French at the Battle of Crécy. He was loved and adored by the people of England alongside his wife, Joan of Kent. And it looked like, with the ageing Edward III, close to his death, that his son, Edward of Woodstock, Edward the Black Prince, would succeed him. But unfortunately, Edward became ill. Edward died of cancer in the 1370s. And the next person that was in line to the throne was Edward III's grandchild, and Edward of Woodstock's son, Richard, or Richard of Bordeaux, as he was known back then. Richard's coronation took place in Westminster Abbey just 11 days after his grandfather's funeral, on Thursday the 16th of July 1377. Now, that seems just an innocuous fact almost, but 11 days after your grandfather's funeral is a very, very short amount of time before a coronation took place. Coronations would normally take place quite a long time after the previous monarch's funeral to allow for a time of mourning to take place. But the country felt it was important, and the lords in particular felt that it was important, that the new king should be crowned as soon as possible, and we'll see why in lesson. This was the first coronation for half a century, and there was enormous popular interest. People travelled from virtually every part of the realm, either to attend the ceremony at Westminster or to line the streets around during the coronation procession. One gentleman of Staffordshire travelled over 100 miles from near Newcastle under Lyme. His journey wasn't particularly one to recall with any pleasure. He was attacked and robbed on the way, but still managed to get down and view the procession. I mean, that shows you just how important this event was. As in the past, the round of festivities began on the eve of the coronation, when the king rode in procession from the Tower of London, which you can see here, to Westminster. It's a fairly short journey as the crow flies, but how Richard did it was he went through these different streets so that people could see that he was about to be coronated as king. And this procession was renowned at the time by chroniclers for being a particularly grand one. And this wasn't just an event for English people or for English lords. It's worth knowing as well that at this time, England as a country, as a kingdom, extended into parts of France, and it could call upon different mercenaries and people from Germany. So during this procession, there was men from Bayeux, which was in northern France. There was also German mercenaries. There was a delegation from Gascony. They were people from all different parts of not just England, but from Europe as well. They were all robed in white in honour of the new king. Richard himself followed behind. He was accompanied by a number of his closest entourage, a number of knights. Most famously, there was a gentleman called Burleigh who held Richard's sword through the procession. The picture that you can see here is of Fleet Street in 2015. Fleet Street was one of the main roads by which this procession walked between the Tower of London and Westminster. But just try and imagine and remove all the skyscrapers, the cranes, I suppose some of the modern architecture as well. And just try and imagine that these streets were absolutely packed at the time. They were so packed that people had to cut a path to actually get Richard from A to B. As Richard went further on into Cheapside, there was even more diversions for him to have a look at. The conduit flowed with wine for the duration of the procession. This was almost 3 hours long. Further west in the same thoroughfare, a mock castle was built, and in its turrets were positioned girls of the king's own age who were dressed in white. They showered him with gilt scrolls as he approached, and then descended to offer him wine in gilt cups. This theme of white was very common during the procession. Richard was dressed in white, his knights that were accompanying were dressed in white, and these girls that had been put in these turrets of this mock castle were also dressed in white. White was obviously the symbol of purity, and it was the symbol of childlike innocence. This is quite a common theme throughout Richard's reign, this idea of childlike innocence. So it's something to I suppose, to keep in mind of. Now, possibly the most bizarre aspect of this whole coronation procession was that Richard now went to bed. This was just the first day of the coronation. The procession from the Tower of London to Westminster Palace wasn't actually part of the formal procedure whatsoever. So it's amazing to think that Richard had to go to bed after seeing all of these different things during the day and having this informal procession through the streets of London. The coronation of the next day, however, provided the setting for pageantry of a more formal kind. It began in the morning with a procession from the palace to the abbey, so there was a second procession. The king was met at his seat in the palace hall by the archbishops and the clergy, and conducted thence to a stage in the centre of the church where his throne was placed. The choir then sang the anthem. They also sang different psalms and a repeat of the anthem again. So this is over the course of almost a few hours already into this procedure, and you've got a 10, 11-year-old boy there watching all of this. Well, actually, not just watching all of this, involved in the process. Meanwhile, at this time, the Archbishop vested himself for Mass, and by the time the anthem had ended, he was ready to lead the king to the altar. There, Richard made his first offering, which took by now traditional form of a pound of gold. Next, the king knelt down on cushions provided for the purpose, while prayers were said. Then he was raised up and led to a chair facing the altar, where the Archbishop administered the oath. Richard swore on the sacrament to uphold the laws and customs of his ancestors, to protect the church and clergy, to do justice to all, and finally to uphold the laws which the people would justly and reasonably choose. In essence, this oath was the same that his grandfather had sworn over 50 years ago, and his great-grandfather 20 years before that. This fourth clause, which was relatively new during the coronation process, was inserted during Edward II's coronation. It was preserved under Edward I's coronation, and by this time it was adding a sense of permanence. But it was something that Richard's advisors didn't particularly want to see in the coronation oath. So it's worth just going through the wording again, and again it's something that we're going to go through in the lesson. But uphold the laws which the people would justly and reasonably choose, and the key word here is choose. After Richard had swore on the sacrament to uphold the laws of the land, there was a change really to the order of the coronation process. This was about the timing of the oath. Previously, the king had taken this oath only after he had been presented to the congregation for their acclamation. So by this, what I'm meaning is that at the very end of the whole coronation process, would this have all taken place? But instead, his advisors had rearranged it so this actually took place at the start. We'll have a think about why this might have been, why Richard's advisors would want to have the oath done at the very start rather than at the end. The remainder of the service followed the traditional form. So after the congregation had voiced their assent that Richard was their true king, Richard was led back to the high altar. The archbishop began the prayer, and Richard knelt down once more. There was more songs that took place, and after this came the most solemn part of the whole coronation process. This part of the ceremony is called the consecration. Now, some view by a golden cloth, Richard was divested of his shirt and touched on the hands, chest, shoulders and head with holy oil. From this moment he was set apart from other mortals, set apart from his subjects. He was God's anointed. He was not, as early medieval monarchs had considered themselves to be, the equivalent of a priest, but he was nevertheless endowed by the Almighty with special powers, the nature of which was made clear in the next part of the service, when he was invested with the insignia of dominion. The first piece of insignia that he was given was a sword. This was to protect the kingdom. The second was a sceptre, the rod of the kingdom, an instrument for the correction of error. The final piece of insignia was a ring. This was the seal of holy faith, and it was a symbol that Richard was the father of the country. The boy king was then solemnly crowned, the crown being held by the Archbishop on one side and the Earl of March on the other. The long service was at last moving to its conclusion. What remained was the celebration of Mass and the performance of homage by the leading barons. So by this, we're meaning that the leading barons of the country, the leading lords, would go to Richard and swear allegiance and loyalty to him. At this point, Richard was expected to stand up from his throne and walk through Westminster out towards the waiting crowd. Something slightly different happened at this coronation. The king was carried shoulder high from the church by one of his knights, a gentleman called Simon Burley. And in the commotion he lost one of his shoes. Again, we'll talk about this within the lesson, but it's just worth remembering. That concludes our first video for the topic of Richard II. It's worth making some notes, and it's worth using the sheet that's been provided as well for you to make those notes. If you're looking for books to have a look a bit more detail on, do look in the sixth form library. Look at Nigel Saul's Richard II, where I've got most of my information from. But any biography of Richard would suffice as well.